In Racing Through Time, we look back at the drivers, the cars, the races and the circuits that made motorsport history. The Jaguar C-Type was the car that set the Coventry mark on the road to racing and commercial success. Wins at Le Mans made Jaguar a famous name worldwide, a position it holds to this day. In Racing Through Time, we meet the key figures in the Jaguar C-Type story. Competition director FWR Lofty England and driver Duncan Hamilton were two who recall this important car in Jaguar's history. William Lyons founded the company that was to become Jaguar in Blackpool, northwest England, in 1922. His first vehicles were sidecars for motorcycles, and he quickly realized that having his product seen on the racing circuit would raise his company's profile. By the mid-1930s, William Lyons had moved his company to Coventry and was building sporting cars. The SS Jaguar 100, so named because it would reach 100 miles an hour, was a successful competitor in circuit racing and rallying. Victory in the 1936 Alpine Rally, followed by a win in Britain's 1937 RAC Rally, established the performance credentials of the SS 100. During the Second World War, Jaguar, like most other manufacturers, were heavily involved in work for the government. Despite this, development work continued, planning what sort of car would emerge post-war. William Lyons wanted to build a sports car capable of 120 miles an hour, with twin overhead camshafts part of the visual appeal. Jaguar was blessed with their team of talented engineers, including Bill Haynes, Harry Mundy, Claude Bailey, and Wally Hassan. The XK120 was introduced at the London Motor Show in 1948 as the Aluminium 120 Super Sports, and it was the hit of the show. It was economically priced at £998 with a streamlined body and spirited performance. The intention was to use the car as a test bed for the Mark 7 saloon. As a means of further publicity, the car had recorded 132.6 miles an hour on Jabeek motorway in Belgium with the test driver Soapy Sutton. With strong demand for the XK120, Jaguar decided to take part in the inaugural one-hour production sports car race at Silverstone in 1949. They hired Prince Bira, Peter Walker and Leslie Johnson to drive the cars. Bira dominated the race until a burst tyre put him out, and eventually the race was won by Leslie Johnson, cheered on by coachloads of Jaguar employees. The late Lofty England, Jaguar's competition manager at the time and later chairman of the company, remembers.
And we then built 5 XK120s, which we dished out to people we thought would do some good and were rather carefully prepared. And of course did very well, like Appleyard, who won the Alpine, and the other cars. One we lent to BMW, who went in the Tiger Flora and the Mille Miglia, which was instructive. And the other to Nick Haynes, who was this car out here, was a Belgian distributor, or joint distributor in Belgium. And he used it at Le Mans. Johnson used his on a number of reasons. And to Peter Walker, who used his on the farm and over the fields, and occasionally brought it back and we blew the shore out of it and went for another race. So that was that. So then we're quite happy with that, you see. And then 3 of these people entered privately for Le Mans in 1950, which was Johnson with Hadley, and Nick Haynes was Peter Clark, who was chairman of the BRDC, that's many years ago, and Peter Whitehead with Walker's car, and Walker was too busy farming, so John Marshall drove with him. So we lent them 1 mechanic each, very generously. They went to Le Mans, and Bill Haynes and I went over just to see the race, and we came away with the conclusion that if we went back the next, because those days you understand that nobody come out with a really modern, properly streamlined sports racing car. If we went back and we used our standard units in effect, engine, axle, gearbox, in a lighter weight frame with a properly designed aerodynamic body, we could win this race. We went back, and he then took about 3 months to convince Sir William to do the job. In the meantime, we got hold of Sayer, you've heard of, Malcolm Sayer, who was this aerodynamist at Bristol. I remember very well Bill Haynes. For many months he had in his office the frame of the C-Type done in matchsticks. This was the development department, you know. And the C-Type was done between December 1950 and the first car ran in March 1951.
In October 1950, Lyons gave the green light to develop the XK120C, C meaning competition. Mechanically, the C-Type was based on the twin-cam straight-six 3.4-litre engine which produced 180 brake horsepower. There was a 4-speed Moss gearbox and the driveline from the XK120. The 120's heavy chassis, itself based on the Mark 7 saloon, was discarded and replaced with a new lightweight tubular steel frame, and rack and pinion steering was installed. And when it was released, there was great surprise in the motoring world.
I don't know why, because I remember it, we made no effort to make a secret of it. And, you know, we all the testing was done at Mara, mostly in the evenings, and there was no bank circuit then, it was on the perimeter track. So all the testing of the C-Type was done by Peter Whitehead, Peter Walker and myself.
At the end of 1950, one of the 6 lightweight XK120s owned by Tommy Wisdom was driven to victory at the Silverstone Tourist Trophy by a young Sterling Moss. Moss then drove the first steel bonnet production XK120 at a sports car race at Silverstone in 1951. That Tourist Trophy victory had seen William Lyons invite Moss to join the Jaguar Works team, and he was to lead it as their fastest driver in the Le Mans 24-hour race. The 1951 Le Mans 24-hour race was the beginning of the C-Type's racing career. And practice showed that the C-Type was very much on the pace. The dent in the front of Sterling Moss's car was the result of hitting a slower car during the night session. The team consisted of Leslie Johnson, seen here on the left of the picture, teamed with Clement Biondetti, the Italian veteran who'd driven an XK120 in the 1950 Mille Miglia. Johnson had driven the XK120 to its first victory and was an accomplished driver and owner of the ERA company. He was considered one of the best British drivers of the era. Peter Walker had been driving since the 1930s, as had his cousin Peter Whitehead. Whitehead was the most experienced British Grand Prix driver at the time of the post-war period. He drove a Ferrari in a number of Grand Prix, winning in Czechoslovakia. Both Walker and Whitehead moved up from the XK120 to the C-Type. The third car was driven by Moss and Jack Fairman. Fairman was also one of the post-war drivers who'd come to prominence driving sports cars and was a steady and reliable competitor. In previous years, he'd driven for Aston Martin and had moved on from the Feltham team, who were to prove one of Jaguar's greatest rivals. Ferrari had won Le Mans in 1949, Talbot in 1950, and the growing importance of the race could be gauged by the American invasion into France at this time. All the sports car manufacturers were looking for success with export markets in mind as Europe recovered from the devastation of the Second World War. French spectators arrived in their thousands hoping for another Talbot victory. Jaguar's chief engineer, Bill Haynes, looked confident before the start. Juan Manuel Fangio and Froilan Gonzalez were driving the 4.5-litre Talbots, and Ferrari was strongly represented. Reg Parnell led the Aston Martin team, and Briggs Cunningham from America arrived with 3 cars. Allards were now fitted with the American Cadillac engine, faster than in 1950 when they'd finished third. The largest capacity cars ahead of the field, the 3 white Cunninghams, easy to spot. As the Talbots go by, look for the Hay Bentley Coupe just coming into the picture. The Jaguars and Aston Martins from midway down the field, and the lone XK120. In the early stages of the race, the Jaguars were prominent, with Moss going out into a tremendous lead and breaking the lap record time after time. MG entered this interesting special, which was a forerunner of the MGA 4 years later. No one could stay with the Jaguars, the Talbots blowing up as they attempted to maintain the pace of the Coventry cars. But Jaguar also had problems with two of their cars, as Lofty England explains.
Well, bear in mind, this is the first race the car had ever competed in. It never competed in a 50-mile race, nothing. But we had not had this trouble in all the testing we'd done. We'd done a lot of testing. But we'd never done any testing where you were able to hold the thing on full bash for 3 miles like you are at Le Mans. This was the answer. And the sump, of course, was different on this thing. So it had a different oil delivery pipe from the pump up to leading up to the filter area, which had been done in copper. And there was just a very little slight vibration period, about 5-7 or something like that. And this was enough to just shatter this pipe, and it broke off. That's the answer to that one. And the first one happened was Biandetti, who was an old timer, and he saw the oil pressure go like this. So he actually got it round to the pit without dropping a bearing. But there was nothing we could do about it. The second one was with Moss, which was in the dark about 11 o'clock at night, and pouring with rain. He didn't obviously see the oil gauge, and the rod came out the side. So then after that, we knew what it was, so we got a hell of a lead with the other car, so we just slowed it down and kept it under this critical RPM and prayed.
And their prayers were answered as the C-Type went roaring on towards victory. The standard XK120, privately entered by Laurie and Waller, went on to finish in 11th place, averaging 83 miles an hour. All eyes by now were on the remaining Jaguar C-Type, driven by Walker and Whitehead. Aston Martin was sure of winning the Index of Performance and the team prize. Away goes the XK120 and VNF64, the most successful of the Aston Martin DB2s. Jaguar pit signal and the time 5:23. Into the pits for a scheduled stop comes Peter Walker. The Herefordshire farmer climbs out, and when the car is refueled, he's replaced by Peter Whitehead. The twin-cam engine and dual SU carburetors are clearly visible. Whitehead tries to get the car into gear, eventually succeeds and goes back into the race. The final stages of Le Mans 1951, with Jaguar heading towards victory. The win was tremendously important for the British motor industry internationally, as well as for Jaguar. The Bentley too was to survive. It was driven to the race, raced, and then driven home to Paris. A Talbot finished in second place. Peter Whitehead brings the winning Jaguar onto the final lap, followed by the XK120. 4 o'clock and the list of retirements. Cheers from the crowd as the Astons come to the finish. And the biggest celebration of all for the C-Type Jaguar driven by Peter Whitehead and Peter Walker alongside. Lofty England walks towards the presentation. A delighted Sir William Lyons greets his drivers. What was the importance Jaguar had placed on victory at Le Mans?
We only raced for one purpose, and that was to get publicity. Free publicity. And the free publicity you only get by getting the front page of the News of the World or Daily Express or something, or radio and TV. And of course, when we won Le Mans the first time, 51, we got all that, all for nothing, which we could never have bought. And that was the thing which really put Jaguar on the map, export-wise. Up to that time, I used to go to America and they'd stop me and say, "What is this car you have there?" They didn't know. After we won Le Mans, they knew what Jaguar was. It was just like that overnight.
Jaguar's next victory with the C-Type was on an entirely different type of circuit. the sweeping Dundrod in Ulster. Ferrari was there with privately entered cars, and so too were the smaller British manufacturers, Allard with Cadillac and Chrysler engines. MG were represented by the Leicester chassised cars. JCC Mayors had put up some fine performances with these. Jaguar had entered 3 of their unusual Jupiters. The DB3 Aston Martin made its debut, with Lance Macklin limping after injuries he'd received in a Formula 2 race a few weeks before. The start and the Jupiters lined up at the head of the field. This was the reverse of Le Mans. MGTDs go through, and now the Jaguars, with an XK120 among the 3 C-types. Leslie Johnson wasn't feeling well at the start of this race and shared his car with Tony Rolt. Rolt was the revelation of the Jaguar team. He'd started racing pre-war at the age of 17 and had bought an ERA from Lofty England. Rolt had been captured after Dunkirk and spent the war in Colditz Castle. Immediately after the war, he returned to racing and became an important part of Jaguar's lineup. Aston Martin's DB3 fell by the wayside at Dundrod, although it did show some speed. It was a disappointment to Aston that they couldn't run with the Jaguar. Allard also retired. Among their drivers on this occasion was later Ferrari Grand Prix driver Peter Collins. The British Fraser Nashes were doing well in the small capacity class. Stirling Moss raced on towards victory, his second tourist trophy in a row. The Jaguar at the hairpin, accelerating away through its 4-speed gearbox to take the checkered flag. A Jaguar first, second and third in the over 3-litre class. Peter Walker impressed Lofty England.
Walker was a farmer, and Walker only drove, in our day, he only drove about 5 times a year. I'd seen him before the war, and he was a have-a-go Joe type. He used to drive in an old ship with his shirt slipped up and no hat, and one come down the straight at Donington sideways almost. But he knew what he was doing, you know. But I reckon Peter Walker, if he'd been able to be a motor racing driver and not just drive occasionally, and he'd kept himself really fit, he'd be in the top of the world. I mean, he could actually go faster than Moss on a road circuit, not this sort of thing, but on a proper road circuit, he was at least equal, if not sometimes better than Moss. And Rolt was a very reliable chap. I knew Rolt from before the war because we sold him, I knew him before we sold it to him, but we sold him one of Bureau's ERAs. And he was a very sensible, knowledgeable, good driver. He had gone to the TT at Dundrod as a reserve driver for Nick Haynes in his XK120. And Haynes shunted it in practice, and Rolt was spare. And Johnson wasn't feeling all that well. And in the race, he wasn't doing all that well, so I stopped him and put Rolt in, and then proceeded to break the lap record. So we thought he was quite a good bloke.
As a standby measure, Jaguar had prepared 3 special-bodied XK120s in case the C-Type wasn't a success. Western USA distributor Charles Hornberg gave one to Phil Hill, who won the Sheldon Cup at Elkhart Lake. However, C-Type development took a wrong turn in 1952.
Well, it was a great mistake, and Sir William had always said no last-minute changes, you know, but he had a lot of faith in Moss, and Moss went in the Mille Miglia, and in actual fact, we found out later, of course, much too late, that when he made this assessment of the Mercedes speed, he'd been off the road in a big way and was just sort of recovering his courage, and he was passed by us, you know, this Mercedes, and he sent the old man this telegram, which I didn't know, saying Mercedes 20 miles an hour faster or something like that than Jack. Must have more speed for Le Mans. I was on my way to Monaco with a car for Moss to drive in the Monaco Grand Prix, which that year was a sports car race. And I didn't know anything about this till I got back.
Jaguar's visit to Monaco was far from successful. In practice and in the race, the Gordini of Jean Beira proved to be exceptionally quick. Moss couldn't match Beira on this occasion. Aston Martin were running there with their first 3-litre engine, but it proved to be very unreliable. Reg Parnell's car shed its oil all over the road at Saint-Devote, causing an accident that took out Beira's Gordini, Moss's 120C and an Allard. The damage was serious for the Aston and the Gordini. In spite of efforts from the team to bang the dents out of Moss's car, he too retired. Next, it was on to Le Mans.
We came back. Fortunately, we dropped the car we'd had in Monaco in Le Mans and came on home. And on the Thursday night, we went in the factory, and there was not one car built. And we were leaving on the Sunday morning. And they'd made this decision to do this, and Sayer had already got these ideas, and they'd done a quick job with the radiator experts. And the car had been run. One car had been put together and run at Mara, but not on the outer circuit, on this old perimeter track. And that was all. So my friend Mr. Haynes says, I think you better take the job over, Ray. This is me. So I think we did 2 all nights, and on Sunday morning we had 3 cars built, painted, and went. But the trouble didn't show up until on the road. It was perfect. They ran stone cold, 50 degrees, 45 degrees or something. But once you got belting down the straight and high RPM, you ran this trouble. But in those days, the problem was that there was no practice session at Le Mans like there is now, pre-race, you know. And the practice finished at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and you couldn't get out of the circuit. So if your car went to Charlie half an hour after you'd started practice, you're stuck. And then you got back to the garage at 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and you know, it wasn't much help. And we didn't rumble what the trouble was till later.
It was a shock for Jaguar to have all 3 cars out of the race after only 2 hours.
About that, yeah. But the Moss car, we didn't go out with that, because on the Saturday morning, having been through all these various things we did, we had got the one car we'd got from Monaco, and we got Duncan's own C-type. We went to Portugal, so we took the radiators off those and went back to the original system on 2 cars. Had to bash up the bonnet a bit to get the thing in. And the second car, the head gasket was down, we'd no more spare heads, and the head was distorted, so that went up to Swanee. And the Moss car was perfectly all right. And that didn't go out with overheating. He was running second, and a little small piece came off we had a little tension spring on the timing chain tension. It broke, and it got under the oil release valve and dropped the oil pressure, and he ran a bearing. But we didn't say anything. We thought that they'd all retire with overheating.
One of the great British drivers and personalities of the 50s was ex-fighter pilot Duncan Hamilton. He joined Jaguar for 1952 at Le Mans, having driven his own XK120 and C-Type as a private entrant. And Hamilton was part of the disappointing race.
Well, that was disappointing, yes, because I also had a private one. I run a few private owners that had a C-Type belonging to myself, and that was in the truck at the back of Le Mans. I could have won the race with my own private one that was in the truck.
The 1952 Le Mans 24-hour was a race of great drama, with Alfred Neubauer presiding over the 3-car Mercedes team. One of his cars retired early with dynamo failure, and the race was dominated by Pierre Levesque in the 4.5-litre Talbot. Levesque attempted to drive the entire race on his own. Exhaustion visible on his face as nominal co-driver René Marchand watches him rejoin the race. Levesque lost the race, blowing the engine while in the lead in the final hour after 23 hours of driving. Aston Martin also didn't make it to the finish. This is Lance Macklin and his last drive of the team. Mercedes were well behind at the retirement of Levesque's Talbot. Levesque was brought back to the pits. The French crowd cheers a Mercedes victory at Le Mans in 1952. The 9-hour race at Goodwood in England. BARC had instituted a race at Goodwood which started in daylight and finished at night. Jaguar were anxious to win, and their C-types, returned to their normal bodywork, were dominant from the start. Pierre Levesque had been invited to drive the Talbot, the Frenchman on the sweeping Goodwood circuit. Aston Martin were expecting to go well, but this pit fire eliminated their 3-litre car. For Jaguar, Moss retired with a broken axle bracket, Whitehead crashed, and Hamilton broke a half shaft, a disappointing result all round. The race was a duel between the 2 remaining Aston Martins and 2 Ferraris, one driven by the up-and-coming Roy Salvadori. This is the C-Type Jaguar, which was prepared for Le Mans in 1953. By now, Jaguar had got over the shock of their Le Mans disaster, and they intended to win the race again. There were to be no mistakes, and serious testing had taken place. The re-engineered C-Type had reduced weight, plus disc brakes all round and triple Weber carburetors. Lofty England describes the philosophy behind Jaguar's approach to the 1953 race.
So William, having been let down in 52, was determined we were going to win in 1953. So the disc brake development had been going on for some time, of course. And so we had the first place, you had to get the car lighter. So it had lightweight body panels. All the panels were lighter. We had a rubber fuel tank. The first people to ever use a rubber fuel tank on a motor car, which stood us in good stead. We never had a fire. The engine was up to 220 horsepower from just about 205, I think it was. We had the disc brakes, and we had a Borgenbeck 3-plate clutch.
Enzo Ferrari presides over his cars during preparation for the 1953 Mille Miglia, the famous Italian road race. His hopes were pinned on the V12 4.5-litre engine Super America, with drivers Farina, Villoresi and the young Mike Hawthorne. Always strong were Italian specialists like the Marzotto brothers with brand new cars. (1953) saw the return of Alfa Romeo to motor racing with the Disco Volante, now with a coupe body and powered by a 3.5-litre 6-cylinder engine. The drivers, Fangio, Sanisi and the German Karl Kling. Much was expected of the Milanese team in the race that was more important than any other in Italy. Oscar was a product of the Maserati brothers. The Maserati Works team was a strong contender with the A6 SSG. Aston Martin's 3-litre DB3s were driven by George Abacassis and Peter Collins, while on the left of the picture is riding photographer Louis Clementaski. Fangio, prior to the start, making his comeback to racing after his accident in 1952 at Monza. The cars filed through the streets of Brescia after scrutineering. Stirling Moss prepares for the start at the wheel of a standard C-Type Jaguar. Tony Rolt was the other works driver. Moss went well in the early part down the fast Adriatic coast road. But once again, rough roads were to prove Jaguar's downfall. It was a difficult race too for Ferrari and Aston Martin. Both Farina and Villoresi were out of the Mille Miglia after accidents. The Aston Martin team suffered from minor problems. Jaguar's Tony Rolt was an early retirement. Ferraris went well as always, but the drive of the race was that of Fangio in the Alfa Romeo. Sanisi was eliminated with mechanical problems, and Fangio, with only one wheel steering after hitting a wall, drove one of his finest events. He finished second, only 12 minutes behind Marzotto's Ferrari after 1,000 miles of driving. The Lancia is wheeled away after the race. In America, Briggs Cunningham was fighting a battle with his big Cunninghams against the British Jaguars, the Italian imports like Ferrari, and the little 1.5-litre Oscar. Sterling Moss and Bob Said won the Sebring 12-hour ahead of all the larger cars. Jaguar conducted some testing at Jabeek. They bought the Le Mans car from 1952, here with SU carburetors, basically to check out the aerodynamics against the normal-bodied C-Type. In the straight-line run, the Autocar magazine had succeeded in getting a standard C-Type up to 143.4 miles an hour. The Le Mans car proved to be a little faster, but not by much. The frontal area of the C-Type was possibly the problem. Nevertheless, it was decided to run at Le Mans with a standard bodywork rather than with a sharp nose which had let them down the previous year. Lofty England was on hand to make the final decision. Notice the bump in the bonnet where they'd altered the header tank. Silverstone for the 1953 sports car race. Scottish team Ecuria Cos had 3 production C-Types on show. There were others entered from the production run of over 50 C-Types. Aston Martin were making their last appearance with the DB3, while the hastily repaired Ferrari of Farina was given to Mike Hawthorne to race. The American Tom Cole with his 4.1-litre Ferrari. Mike Hawthorne with his father Leslie during practice. Leslie Hawthorne stands in the background, a proud father. Young Mike was now a fully fledged member of the Ferrari team. Fraser Nash's were also well represented. Cliff Davis's Tojiro, the prototype for the AC Ace, and ultimately the most copied car of all time, the AC Cobra. Sterling Moss had won the saloon car race in the Mark VII Jaguar, but had a big accident in practice for the sports car race and was severely bruised. Hawthorne inspects the Ferrari prior to the Le Mans-style start. Moss chats with William Lyons, and Peter Walker also joins in the conversation. Hawthorne always tried to make Moss laugh on these occasions, but was concentrating enough to make an excellent getaway. Underneath the green overalls, Moss was bruised and battered. He got away at the start first, but was soon to lose the lead. An Allard was an early retirement, and Hawthorne went on to dominate. Trying to keep up, a C-Type on the grass and Hawthorne perilously close to photographers. Those were the days. Hawthorne rushes past the pits with a lead over the Aston Martins, and the Jaguars outclassed on home ground. These were the exciting days of sports car racing. Hawthorne pulled out a tremendous lead, and it was the Ecuria Cos Jaguars, rather than the works cars, battling with the Aston Martins. Tom Cole's Ferrari and Peter Walker with the leading factory C-Type. Reg Parnell in the Aston, and this is Sterling Moss back in 5th place. The first of the Ecuria Cos cars driven by Ian Stewart and Hawthorne lapping tailenders. And so Mike Hawthorne in the 4.1-litre Ferrari showed the way home to everyone at Silverstone. Jaguar supporters were far from happy at the prospects for Le Mans with the SU carburetted C-Type. But 24 hours is a totally different story to that of 25 laps around Silverstone. While Lofty England signals the drivers and the lap scorers keep their heads down, the Ferrari streaks on towards victory. At the end of the race, the cars come back into the paddock. Moss is disappointed, and the Aston Martin team were also far from happy at their performance. The 3-litre Aston DB3 was short of pace. The third works C-Type, followed by Fraser Nash and Cliff Davis at the wheel of the Tojiro. Despite this result, William Lyons was quietly confident about Jaguar's chances at Le Mans.
And he was absolutely determined. 53, we were going to win. And we really got down to it, you know, and there was no mucking about. And all the cars were ready in time and this sort of thing, and off we went. We drove them over there. And in practice, they were so good, we didn't even practice the last evening.
Le Mans in the 1950s, and the refueling equipment is calibrated. Maintenance work goes on in the pits, which were used until quite recently. In the 1950s, Le Mans was still primarily a road circuit. Even with upgrades and safety improvements, it retains that atmosphere today. The town welcomes spectators with the cafes and the hotels doing tremendous business. 1953 was to be the year of the great battle between all the major sports car manufacturers. The crowds came in their thousands, preparing to watch the race from their favourite vantage points. The press tribunes and the spectator enclosures were packed. Moss talks before the start. Hamilton and Rolt emerge from the Jaguar caravan, and Duncan tells us what it's like to win a 24-hour race at Le Mans.
Well, first of all, you must be fit, and very fit. And you must be able to drive in the dark. But Tony, Rolt and myself, had studied Le Mans very closely, and he'd had plenty of time to study it in Colditz, where he was a prisoner of war. And I studied it with him afterwards, and in those days, we realized that the race was won in the dark, and whoever beat the night won the race. And in the history of the race, that was what we found. So we didn't mind too much about the speed. I had flown a lot in the dark, in all sorts of things, and his eyesight was very good. We concentrated on the dark and the bad weather. When people relax in the dark and say, well, dawn will soon be here, we realized that's the time to really press on and would drive faster. In fact, I put the lap record in the dark.
Gendarme keeps the crowd back, and the cars are already lined up. A hush comes over the huge crowd. At the head of the lineup is the supercharged Gordini. Next are the big white Cunninghams. John Fitch makes a fine start in the unique Cunningham CR5. The Lanciers get away, and the Jaguars are already weaving their way through the traffic. From the start, the race becomes a tremendous battle between Jaguar and Ferrari. The Ferrari Coupe, driven by Ascari and Villaraisi, fought it out with the two Jaguars, Moss at the wheel of one and Tony Rolt at the wheel of the other. The end of the Mulsanne, and Jaguar's disc brakes show their superiority. The Ferrari had slightly more powerful engines. Moss, Ascari, Rolt, first, second and third. Within the first hour, Moss's car had its usual jinx. There was a fuel feed problem, and the car rejoined down the field, seemingly out of contention. The Cunningham was in the pits for a routine stop. The American cars, never quite on the pace, but were usually there at the finish. Meanwhile, tyres are changed at the back of the pits, cushions put in to accommodate a smaller driver who climbs aboard the Cunningham. Out in the lead, it was Duncan Hamilton with a C-type Jaguar.
The car never missed a beat, and in practice I'd broken the lap record time after time with it. I was very happy with the car. It felt right. It did everything right. It stopped, it steered, and we thought we were very happy. It turned out we were right. And during the night, like the south, the heavy mist, like a fog, descends. I was leading the race by then. And according to all the scribes that be and all the paperwork that I have today and all the magazines, I was dropping 2 seconds in a 8-mile lap in thick fog, which isn't very much.
Dawn breaks at Le Mans and Jaguar are leading. The C5R goes through, as does Tom Cole, shortly to lose his life when his Ferrari crashes. It's still Rolt and Hamilton. The Ferrari has fallen by the wayside with electrical problems. Meanwhile, a fine drive by Stirling Moss and Peter Walker have brought that car up to second place. The Cunningham Coupe in the pits. Back in fourth place, running with a different axle ratio, is Peter Whitehead and Ian Stewart in the third of the works Jaguars. The Belgian-entered standard C-Type is running in 9th place. There's ribbing down the back to strengthen the rear quarters where the extra petrol tank is located. Work completed as the Cunningham Coupe returns to the race. Disc brakes were in their infancy. To change pads in this era took around about 4 minutes. In such a long race as Le Mans, that delay was easily outweighed by the better performance of the discs over drum brakes. The leading Jaguar closes on the Cunningham Coupe to lap it once again, and the crowds wait for the finish. A Jaguar victory for Rolt and Hamilton in 1953. 3 works Jaguars in the first 4 places. Angela Hamilton and Louise Rolt celebrate with their husbands. Lofty England remembers a fine performance.
That was the finest race, I think, that's taken place at Le Mans since the war. You've got every make of car you can think of, and all the top drivers from Fangio downwards.
Amazing race.
It was super. And the cars were we had practically no trouble. The winning car had nothing done to it the whole race except wheels and tyres being changed.
A week later, on the Isle of Man, YMY 307, the prototype Aston Martin, was driven by Reg Parnell to victory. Hans Rusch slides his Ferrari. Moss was in a privately owned C-Type in this street race around Douglas. But Jaguars never seemed to go so well on their home ground. The 1953 Goodwood 9-hour was another disappointment for Jaguar.
It wasn't really oil surge, no. It had a wet sump. And during the development for Le Mans, we had a hell of a job to stop oil surge, to the extent where they had an enormous amount of baffling in the sump, you see. And the trouble is the oil blazes, it's just like on a frying pan. And Goodwood as you know, there's no room for the thing to cool down on the straight. It's on that. And we've been perfectly all right if my dear friends, Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Walker, hadn't decided to have a race on their own, although we were leading the race. They had a nice little race on their own, and the oil temperature went up and up and up, and you could see this coming, and they just didn't pay any attention. They told to slow down, and they carried on. So one goes the rod out the side, and then comes the second one, and that was that.
By the end of 1953, it was becoming clear that Jaguar needed a new model if they were to continue their success in sports car racing. 1954 saw the debut of the D-Type Jaguar, a pure sports racing car as opposed to the modified road-going C-Type. The C-Type was still a competitive combination in both 53 and 54. Ikiri gave Jaguar placings internationally, Salvadori and Stewart finishing second at the Nürburgring and second at Spa and in Barcelona. The C-Type was back at Le Mans in 1954 for private entries, although the works interest was on the D-Types, which is a story for another Racing Through Time. Jaguar entered 3 of their new D-Types, but there was one C-Type for the Belgian team led by Jacques Swatters and Roger Laurent. The Belgians had long been a supporter of Jaguar, with one of their C-Types finishing in 9th place in the 1953 race. In 1954, the Swatters and Laurent car gave a surprising performance against formidable opposition. It was a race that was remarkable because of a wet circuit and a tremendous fight between the Maurice Trintignant Froilan Gonzalez Ferrari and the Rolt Hamilton D-Type. The Swatters C-Type finished in 4th place. It was basically a standard C-Type production car with a little bit of help from the works. Jaguar came back to Le Mans in future years, but the tradition had been established by the C-Type with its wins in 1951 and 53. Over 50 C-Types were built by the works, and most of them survive today and can be regularly seen in historic races. It's a testament to the original design that the 6-cylinder engine, debuted in 1948, lasted in production until the 1980s. The C-Type Jaguar was one of the last real 2-seater sports cars that could be driven on road and track. It provided its owners and the factory with an enviable reputation. The success of the C-Type helped turn Jaguar from a small-scale sports car builder into a major manufacturer. At Silverstone, the 1953 Le Mans winning C-Type. Once again at the wheel, Duncan Hamilton, and beside him, his son Adrian. Having spent a considerable time in the Briggs Cunningham Museum in the USA, the Jaguar returned to England in the early 1990s. Behind it, the Leslie Johnson car, together with a number of fine British sports cars of the 1950s. Notice the difference between the Special Works C-Types of 1953 and the production C-Types, the air intake of the Weber carburetors and the ribbed petrol tank on the back. The passion for motor racing of the past allows us to see these cars in action to this day. Jaguar became part of the British Leyland Combine in the 1960s, and in 1989 it became part of Ford. They build more road cars than ever, though perhaps not with the same sporting pedigree. Of course, the Leaping Cat is now seen in Formula One in the new version of British Racing Green. And why do Jaguar go racing in the expensive and uncertain world of Formula One? For the same reason the Jaguar built the C-Type over 50 years ago, to generate publicity and help sell cars. That's one thing that hasn't changed in the race through time.